Started. So welcome everybody to Fair Vote Toronto's webinar series. My name is Megan Max. I'm a volunteer with the Toronto chapter of Fair Vote Canada, and I'll be facilitating the webinar tonight. So I'd like to start off tonight with a land acknowledgement and statement of support. So as we join tonight online from all over Canada, we at Fair Vote Toronto wish to acknowledge that the land from which we join you has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to them for the opportunity to work on this land. Though there's much work to be done in this country to achieve a just and fair society for all, securing a more proportional electoral system is an important step in achieving this goal, as it would allow every Canadian to make their voice heard electorally to better ensure politicians prioritize what Canadians care about. For just a brief introduction to our organization, Fair Vote Canada is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization advocating for a citizens' assembly on electoral reform in Canada and its provinces. Fair Vote Toronto is one of the many chapters across the country, which helps us to lobby local MPs and mobilize at the grassroots level. So through our webinar series, we're hoping to connect the issue of proportional representation to other pressing issues, to demonstrate that electoral reform is an important route of political change and discuss strategies for achieving it. So tonight, for the fourth installment in our webinar series, we're joined by two panelists, Professor Laura Stephenson and David Moscrop. So Laura Stephenson is a professor of political science at Western University, specializing in political behavior, elections, and voting. She's the co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, an investigator on the 2019 Canadian Election Study, and a co-investigator on the Canadian Municipal Election Study. Very qualified. So David Moscrop is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post and the author of Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. He's also the host of Open to Debate, a current affairs podcast. He also holds a PhD in political science from UBC. So welcome, David, and welcome, Laura.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
So great to have you joining us. So tonight's webinar will feature a Q&A with David and Laura. Then at the end, we'll try to take some questions from the audience. So throughout the hour, feel free to submit any questions to that Q&A function through Zoom. So our first question tonight is going to provide us a bit of context for our conversation. So Laura, can you please walk us through Ontario's history with electoral reform?
Sure, happy to. But I'm going to restrict it to the 2000s because a lot of us don't want to go back further than that, although of course there's a lot of history behind that. But Dalton McGuinty basically brought in a process of electoral reform for Ontario. And this came after we'd had some experience in Ontario where the winning party of the election did not have a majority of the votes. Now that's actually pretty common in Canada. And so it's a reason to think that obviously if your vote shares and your seat shares don't add up, it can cause consternation. And more than that, I think McGuinty kind of came to office with a suite of things that he wanted to do. And one of them was addressing electoral reform. So going about doing electoral reform, I think that's because it really was in many ways. So a number of academics and experts were brought together to kind of create a curriculum for the Citizens Assembly. And again, because there was a model from BC, it was relatively, I'll say, easy to do in the sense that they knew what they had wanted to do. And then they got to people chosen from across Ontario, looking for good distribution geographically, as well as a gender breakdown and some Indigenous representation. And they essentially brought these people together to teach them, right, about electoral systems and what does it mean and what is the best way to even vote in Canada or in Ontario, sorry. And then this group of individuals in the Citizens Assembly came up with, well, actually they deliberated significantly. They learned, they talked, they debated, and they come up with a solution. And that was the proposal that was put forward, a version of MMP or mixed member proportional. And then that was put to a referendum in 2007 and thoroughly defeated. So that would be the end, that punchline. I think I got there pretty quick.
Fantastic. So both Laura and David, then, in your views, why do you think these Ontario attempts failed? Was it a combination of factors, political, process-based, or was the public just uninterested?
David, do you want to go first, or do you want me to do it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, I'll be honest with you, Megan. I don't think anyone in Ontario had thought much about electoral reform, and I don't think they were all that interested, I'll be honest. And I think that's exactly what happened. And so the enthusiasm that had existed for the BC situation, and I say enthusiasm because they tried it 2 more times, right, after their first one failed, because it didn't reach a supermajority. But in Ontario, it was just not as interesting. Didn't capture the public's attention. I don't think that there was anything wrong with how the Citizens Assembly was conducted, but it really just didn't have the same appetite amongst the public, and nor was it, I guess, nor was it received with the same amount of enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, the communication around it was not as strong as it might have been as well. I mean, this is a classic problem with a lot of the policymaking processes. You get 9/10 of the way there, and you just can't get the last little bit because you can't communicate it. You can't rally folks. If you contrast with the BC situation, as Laura suggested, what you see is people were interested in part because there had been, at least in the first round in the early 2000s, there had been elections that were wonky. So people had an immediate example and experience that spoke to what a fundamental sense of unfairness, right? The party that was forming government had received fewer votes than the party that had lost. Incidentally, it's happened before. It happened quite a few times before. And sometimes you get some really egregious, bizarre outcomes. And people look at it and say, in what world does that make sense? Not only did you not have a majority of votes, you had fewer votes than the other party, and you still formed a majority government. Not just a minority government, but even a majority government. And so it's those sort of pronounced inequities that I think really get people going. And so this is one of the takeaways from that is that you've got to get people on board with the hook. I mean, there's got to be something that captures their attention, because otherwise it sort of seems abstract and they just don't see what it's about. And I think there was a little bit of that in 2015. We can talk about 2015, I suspect, in a moment, but there's a little bit of that then. That's just people it doesn't connect with people. And I think if you'll see in British Columbia, I mean, that's my hypothesis to sort of build off of what Laura was saying. And I think you see subsequent iterations in BC indicate as much, because it had far less support the next 2 times. And I suspect, well, we can talk about the last BC attempt if you want. I'm not entirely sure the government's heart was in it, which didn't help either.
Well, just to build on that point, if you don't mind, Megan, just for a moment, which is that the wrong winner election, which is what David was referring to in BC, I mean, is really important. And I think it was a big push towards them doing the Citizens Assembly and then moving from there. Not only did it happen prior to that, but 2019 in Canada federally was a wrong winner election, right? And famously, so was 2016 in the US. But for the Electoral College, right, we would have had a woman president earlier. So when we think about it in that way, absolutely, it is a point, I think, of anger and motivation for people to ask for change. But there are other reasons too, right? Like in Prince Edward Island, for example, they've been trying to change their electoral system for a long time, and that's because they actually don't get effective oppositions, which I would argue is far worse, right? You imagine if your government had 95% of the seats and there was no one else there. That's not much of a check, right, on what's going on.
Great, thanks. And just because we have a lot of ire about this in the chat right now, people are pretty upset about referendums. So maybe just to jump in with a question, are referendums a terrible way to make a decision about electoral reform?
I see a vociferous yes. I mean, I do not like referendums. I like participatory democracy. I don't particularly care for referendums, in part because they're just not great participatory tools. They don't encourage thoughtful exchange or debate. They sort of, it boils everything down to a yes or no, as if everything were black and white. And then you often get inequities built into that based on who has more money, if money's a factor, or who can best shape the narrative. I mean, you know, that's how politics works. I get it, but it's not the best way to communicate complicated policy questions to people. I mean, I'm of the opinion that ordinary day-to-day folks have phenomenal capacity to make political decisions when they have the time and the resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the institutions in which to do so. I mean, the answer to my book, there's a reason it's a question mark, and the answer is no, right? The whole c-dem for democracy question mark affectation is a means to answer in the negative. I mean, if people aren't too dumb for political decision making, not even close, but they certainly tend to get played for reasons that often have nothing to do with them. And so one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is that these are good institutions that produce good outcomes because they encourage and facilitate good decision-making processes where people have the time, the energy, sometimes the compensation. And if we did them really well, we'd make sure that folks had compensation, childcare, you know, elder care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that people could actually take part. And when you do those things, you get pretty good outcomes. So I've evolved on this a little bit since from 2015. Evolved is the word politicians use when they change their mind now. Evolve, and you know, I used to think, well, you should have a citizens' assembly and a referendum. I actually think now you should have a citizens' assembly and then a vote in Parliament to affirm what's been done. That's my preferred course of action right now because I think it's better. And arguably, I'll close on this point because I'm rambling a little bit. If you had a good representative citizens assembly, you'd probably get a more representative position of the public than a referendum that has an unrepresentative turnout.
I would agree with David that I don't think referenda are the best way to do this. Maybe for some slightly different reasons. I think that you're absolutely right that, you know, any kind of yes/no vote is very difficult to do with this kind of a question because it is very complex and there's lots of nuance. But I also think that a lot of people just don't pay attention. And I thinking in my mind about one of the more recent times that Prince Edward Island tried to do electoral reform, and they actually came up with an answer, right? They actually came up with a new electoral system that they were going to choose because of the nature of their voting system, but the turnout was less than 40%. So the government, which had actually wanted to change the electoral system, so this wasn't a case of politics getting in the way, said, wait a sec, we can't really do this because we have so little support for doing anything at all because no one turned out to vote. And so I think we have to remember that even in our normal elections, we're not getting a lot of support, right, from the public. We're not getting a lot of decision makers. And then when you put to somebody a question that is either the status quo, which they know, and even if they don't like, it happens. And, you know, we haven't fallen apart yet, or something new and different that, of course, a whole bunch of people are arguing about all the nasty things that are going to happen, then it basically means the default choice is going to be no. Right. And that's, I think, across the board for most referendums. So questions like this, I don't think are appropriate.
Gotcha. Okay. So to switch into the federal jurisdiction, David, could you please walk us through the federal government's most recent attempts into electoral reform?
Do you want the straight up news telling or the sort of my editorial hypothesizing alongside it?
Well, the question after this is your opinions on what went wrong. So just give us the journalistic.
Well, I mean, there's been a movement inside the Liberal Party for a while to put electoral reform onto the ballot at the party level. I mean, this is something that happens in parties all the time. That activists within parties put stuff on the party agenda. It sometimes gets put into the platform. It often doesn't. You know, for instance, the Liberal Party, as a party, the grassroots folks support decriminalizing drugs. The government doesn't, the sort of official party platform doesn't, although there's some movement towards that. So you can see a sort of semi-organic process in which things make their way up through the party and then sometimes take some time to make it to the government agenda or the opposition platform, sometimes don't at all. Electoral reform did, but I actually think that was more of a top-down thing when there were brains inside the Liberal Party who thought it was a good idea. And so it made its way onto the 2015 platform, and it became a pretty big plank, and a reason that for at least some folks are voting for the Liberals in 2015. And the promise was that 2015, these are the infamous words we all remember, will be the last election to first past the post. of course, that didn't happen. So the next step was, once the Liberals won a majority, it went through Parliament. They decided they wanted a committee, so they struck the Special Committee on Electoral Reform, the ERRE, that had hearings in Ottawa and then traveled the country. I was at one in British Columbia as a witness. And they talked to folks, said, what do you want, what do you want, what do you want? And it was proportionally made up. So the Liberals didn't dominate that committee the way they would dominate usual committees. It was actually a more equitable distribution among the parties. Now, more or less, it broke down that the Liberals were sort of in the middle. The NDP and the Greens wanted reform, and the Tories didn't want reform, more or less, with a little bit of nuance. And so ultimately what happened was the committee reported in favor of some changes. The Liberals, who were the minority, I'm pretty sure they were the minority, had a counter. Were they the minority on the?
Oh, on the committee? Sorry.
On the committee?
Yeah, sorry.
They were, right? So the committee released its report, which conflicted with what the Liberals had preferred, and the Liberals had a counter report from the committee that said there was sort of no clear preference for folks. To the extent that there was a preference, it was for reform, proportional reform. The Liberal side didn't support it. Again, we can get into this in a second, but the general sense was that the Liberals, to the extent that they wanted any reform, wanted a ranked ballot. And that was what they were in for, and they couldn't get it. And so ultimately, it was quashed. And it was some sort of, the government justification when it was quashed was a mix of, there's no consensus, and we're worried about extremist parties rising up under PR, and the little bit of like math is hard justification that came up when Mariam Monsef attacked the Gallagher Index, which was not a high point in the history of this government.
Yeah, so there is so much hope for this promise, right? So David, starting with you, what went wrong and why did it fail?
Well, two things. It failed because the Liberals, to the extent they wanted reform, wanted ranked ballot, and they had a majority in Parliament. They just didn't have to accept anything else. Right? Like I think, it was very clear that Justin Trudeau did not support proportional representation, and that was clear prior to 2015. There was never any indication that he supported PR. It became conflated that his support for electoral reform was support for PR, and that was a big problem early on. The reason we didn't get electoral reform is that the Liberals didn't want proportional representation, and to the extent that the winds were blowing, they were blowing for proportional representation. I mean, I think that's the big ultimate takeaway. What went wrong with it? Well, the Liberals had a majority government. Right? I mean, it was hard. But that said, when I went to ERRE, I remember saying, look, I think we should have a citizens' assembly on this, followed by either a vote in Parliament to rubber stamp what the assembly came up with, or a referendum if we must have a referendum. And the reason I wanted that, and what I said to the committee at the time was, especially the opposition members who supported PR, if you don't commit the Liberals to the government to a fair process, you're going to get rolled on this so hard if they see something they don't like, because there's just no reason for them to go ahead with you. And I remember the opposition MPs saying to me, well, this is our job. I'm thinking like, okay, it is your job technically to do this, but again, they're going to roll you. You're never going to get PR in that. And so there was the process was bad. Not only did the Liberals have a majority, which would have prevented any sort of reform that they didn't like, the process was bad from the start. There was a parliamentary committee that was meant to somehow come up with the solution, and a website. I don't know if people remember the website, which it was unclear what exactly it was meant to do. It got sort of roundly mocked, somewhat unfairly, a sort of like what Harry Potter house are you kind of quiz. But there was much more to it than that. But it looked like that because it didn't seem representative. It wasn't clear what it was going to do. People thought you could game it. There was all kind of nonsense there. So the process was sort of bad from the start. And I think the big takeaway from that is, in the future for electoral reform, governments need to be pre-committed to a clear process that lays out what percent, who's going to decide, what are the criteria for deciding, right? What's the threshold for deciding? Are you going to listen to a citizens' assembly? And if you must go to a referendum, to sort of echo what Laura was just saying, what's the threshold for turnout for counting at this thing? which you've got to lay out in advance, right? Rather than saying after the fact, oh, just kidding, 40% we've decided is enough. Somewhat like British Columbia did in 2005, but ideally without a supermajority, because I always hasten to add 57.7% or whatever it was, 56.7, whatever it was, 57% of people in BC said yes to electoral reform, which is extraordinary, to sort of echo what Laura was saying about the negativity bias or the no bias in these things. You had nearly 60% of people said yes to something pretty complicated. And you almost never get that on anything. It's tough to do.
And just to rewind in your response a couple minutes, just so we can clarify for people, why was it that Liberals wanted the ranked ballot option and didn't want proportional representation?
I don't know. I'd have to, that would be speculative. I mean, people speculate it's because they think they would do better under ranked ballot. I mean, that's the same speculation that people offer when they think that the NDP wants PR because the NDP would do better under PR, right? Or the Greens for that matter. In fact, the Greens are probably the better test case there. That's the sense. I get the sense that there were a handful of Liberals in the senior ranks who just thought who preferred that system for probably reasons we won't know until the books come out 30 years from now.
Just
Laura, do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Sure. So actually, I would say that there is some evidence the Liberals would do better under alternative vote from a project that we did with the Ontario data, actually, given that the Liberals hold the same ideological position in both the federal level and the provincial level. It's not surprising, but that's also because the alternative vote process is kind of designed to get you a consensus candidate. So any centrist party is going to do better just by nature of them being the easier to swallow pill, let's say, for those either on the right or the left. So I think that would be where that probably comes from. I mean, it's also a majoritarian system, right? So we often talk about our system as being majority wins. Not really, right? It's plurality wins. And in a majoritarian system, you literally make sure you have a majority of people in support of a specific candidate. But I actually wanted to take a little bit of a different spin on why it didn't work, if you don't mind, Megan. Because I don't know, I've actually taught that report. So like David, I was a witness, and it was really interesting to sit there and get to meet Elizabeth May, and wasn't that cool? But beyond that, once I saw the report that came out, first off, it's a who's who of political scientists, not just in Canada, but around the world. So it was like, I know all these people. This is really cool. And you get to hear them, their thoughts and read them, I guess. And so I've assigned it to classes before. But what was fascinating to me is that in my mind, the report is a microcosm of the challenges of electoral reform, which is that other than recommending the Gallagher Index, they actually didn't recommend much of anything. Yes, proportionality for sure. But the problem is, and this is what I actually think is a fundamental problem with electoral reform attempts, is that proportional representation does not mean an electoral system. What it means is an entire family of electoral system that ranges so significantly that the devil is in the details, right? And to an extreme extent. And this is why I almost laughed when the report came out with all the dissenting opinions. I was just like, oh my gosh, none of you guys like any of this. This is crazy. I thought this committee was actually supposed to come up with a system. And I was very, very disappointed. And I don't know to what extent the Liberal Party would have actually attempted to do something more if there had been a firm system proposed. I mean, I agree with David that their own personal interests were not in favor of that. But really, truly, the report basically said, we've taken all this time, we've done all this work. We think it should be more proportional somehow. Good luck on that. And that was like washing their hands. And it was very difficult. And I think, in that sense, a citizens' assembly has done much better, right? Because they've actually been forced to choose. They've been forced to decide, okay, if we're doing a mixed member system, are we having how many seats in that upper tier? Are we extending the size of the legislature? Are we doing, reserved seats? Are we doing this? Are we doing that? And they didn't answer any of those kinds of questions because all they did is gather a whole bunch of opinions and then go from there.
And they weren't asked to, right? Sorry, pardon me, just to refresh my memory. I don't think the committee was asked to do that, right? I mean, they were sort of set up from the start to be vague, unless I'm missing something.
It's quite possible. I don't recall their mandate. I just know that if it had been effective, in my mind, this committee would have come up with a proposal. And, the experience, I'd say that Quebec has done more of this type of affair, right? And they can come up with something a little more concrete. I mean, obviously, New Zealand didn't have a citizens' assembly. They were able to come up with a system. The Law Commission report in the early 2000s came up with a system. That's why I was disappointed, because I think if you want to take a serious attempt, you have to put something forward.
Awesome. So to take another, to look at this from another angle, in both of these cases of electoral reform, what do you think was done right? And is there anything there that we can leverage of those good aspects of the past attempts that we can carry forward into our future attempts? Nothing good.
I defer to Laura.
That's not. I think if we're to learn anything from this system, is that electoral reform is something that a lot of people agree is a very good idea, and it is complex and difficult to figure out. And that doesn't mean that citizens can't figure it out. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. What it does mean is it requires committed leadership, right? And so, in my view, and I think this is kind of what David had already said, right? If Trudeau had been truly committed to electoral reform, then he would have put something forward. I mean, for goodness sakes, he would have had it passed in Parliament, right? So the fact that he didn't should be an indicator of how serious he was. And to be fair, I mean, I think he came up with the policy idea when the Liberals were worried they were going to just go off into the history books and the NDP was going to become the next party on the left for good, right? So it wasn't, I don't think, a real situation going on there. But like the way McGuinty did it, and I'm not trying to sing anyone in particular's praises, more just that when you commit to a process and then you follow it through, I think you have a better chance of doing it. That all being said, with referenda as difficult as they are, I mean, I would be more in favor of governments making a change and pushing something through. And I say pushing because I think that's literally what has to happen. It has to get passed, hopefully with consensus. That would be better. And of course, the committees can be formed appropriately that would not be politically self-interested. But beyond that, I mean, I really do think we're in a situation where we need someone to push forward with leadership and then potentially have maybe a confirmatory referendum afterwards, after experiencing one or two elections, when it's not the great unknown, right, for voters.
Yeah, I quite like that, and I think, one thing to take away is that the BC Citizens Assembly model was quite good. I mean, it really is a good example of how these things can work. I mean, they work extraordinarily well, with or without a referendum, ideally without. But they do work, and we know how to design them. I mean, I think people have been thinking about this stuff for years now. That we've come a long way in how we think about designing citizens' assemblies and participatory institutions. We know that there are things you want to do to get good representation, to get effective representation, to get effective outcomes. So we can design these things, and we need to do it. But committing to a very clear process is a great way to start. And I think getting someone to do that is going to be crucial, because again, the way the Liberals played folks in that is a good example of how it goes real bad real fast. And then there's almost no accountability for that. There's very little accountability for that ultimately, right? I mean, you could say it had some effect on the Liberals' poor performance in 2019. I'm not sure how much that's true. I would suspect that wasn't top of mind for very many voters. I don't think there's a lot of folks who voted liberal in 2015 and voted for someone else in 2019 because of electoral reform. I really don't think that's the case. I mean, there are very few issues that are determinative of votes in the first place. The idea that it might be electoral reform that's going to be one of them is a bit much. As much as I wish that it had been, right? And that it would be, I don't think it was. So I do think one of the big takeaways is that we need to commit to a good process ahead of time, and that to the extent that it's possible, it should be inclusive. I say that with the knowledge that a lot of the sort of like 19th century PR pushes were utterly partisan, skullduggery affairs where parties were trying to wrong foot other parties strategically. I'm not sure that would be great for us, though. Although I agree with Laura very much. So someone needs to lead on this and just say we're going to do it. But I do think if you do that, having the confirmation referendum after is reasonable. And they did that. New Zealand had its confirmation referendum, right? Which, if you go back and read about the stuff in 1994, the talk around what would happen if electoral reform were passed was absurd. It was just the most, scurrilous nonsense. But then years later, people are like, okay, well, we're used to this now, right? It just works. And I think a huge part of getting, electoral reform on the agenda, is getting used to it. But part of that is also, we all have our pet preferences for what we want electoral reform to look like. To speak to another one of Laura's points, is a family of systems, and for those of us who advocate PR, we can't even agree amongst ourselves what that would be. Obviously the big breakdown is sort of MMP versus STV, but even within that, like, there are different kinds of battles. And if we can't get that worked out at this level, what's the public going to think?
So to think about these different processes, I think there's pretty good consensus here in this discussion that we need a really good pre-commit really well to a process. But whether this looks like a special committee, a referendum, or a citizens' assembly, can the political motives ever really be removed from the process of deciding on the new system, or will people always prefer a system that most benefits their favorite party? And is there anything that we can do to minimize this politicization to secure a system that is fair and balanced?
So if you don't mind on that point, I think actually it's an interesting one. Absolutely, they always, the parties seem to go down along lines of what they think is best for them. I think that was why the Conservatives were pushing for a referendum if we did have electoral reform in 2015, right? But one thing is pretty much what actually ended up happening in Ontario. So there were a lot of negative sides to that too, which is the parties stayed out of it, right, for the most part. And to the extent the parties literally stay out of the discussion, then they don't provide any cues for their voters about what would be good or bad, right? And so, I mean, voters aren't stupid. They can make their own calculations and they can make their own choices. But it's the leadership of parties that sometimes comes up with this, the sky is falling kind of doom and gloom options, or everything is going to be perfect and rosy, which is also, I think, equally problematic, right? So you really just need the parties to stay the heck out of it and let people make up their own minds. And I think people can, obviously. I mean, choosing amongst the specifics of MMP, especially, I would say, because I find it has so many nuances to it, is challenging. And I don't think that I don't want to do it. And this is what I do, right? So I don't want to be in charge of designing a system. But I think there's enough kind of a room that if you'd be willing to accept a system under that type and you don't have any kind of political guides about whether you should like it or not like it, if the answer is we want this type because this will be this way, it's, compared to not having a change, for example, that might be, an interesting way forward.
Great, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should start from the premise that single member plurality is not a neutral system. It's not some platonic system that was plucked down from nowhere as fair. It was inherited. The fact that we got it was an artifact of history. It could have been otherwise. And we've never had a very serious national choice between keeping it or not. Parties have not really allowed us to have a serious choice in the modern era. It could change. So, I mean, I think we should get away from this idea that we can't touch the electoral system, because the one we got, we didn't choose. We were given it to. And, so that's part of it. If you were to say to me, okay, well, you're in charge, what do we do? The first thing I would say was pick someone else. But if you had said, no, you've got to choose, I would say, have a National Citizens Assembly that is representative. Commit to a parliamentary free vote on whether or not to adopt their findings. Adopt the findings, if you adopt them, and then have a confirmation referendum in a decade or X number of elections, whatever the details are. And that's the process that I would advocate for. And I think it would work. And I think that's pretty reasonable, ultimately. I think it's a pretty reasonable compromise because there is an inherent status quo bias in this system. All of that said, I would also support Laura's point that to the extent that the parties say it, the better. And that's one of the things I was sort of pushing at the ERRE back in 2015, saying that everyone thinks you're in the bag for your own system because that system will work for you. And of course everyone was, right? I mean, we know how these things work. Of course they were. That doesn't mean that they didn't believe it was a good system. But your sense of what's a good system is going to be colored by your partisan interests and your strategic interests, because you think that you winning, for instance, is good. and there are reasons that are bound up in why people support these things that are hard to extricate from strategic interests, possibly impossible, even for the individuals who are themselves processing this stuff. I mean, I have that trouble all the time. As a socialist, socialists would do better under PR. Like real socialists, not New Democrats. Some New Democrats are socialists, but like not social democrats, socialists. And I have days where I think, well, how much of my own support for PR is bound up with that? You can never really deeply know. This is Nietzsche territory now. It might be a little bit late for Nietzsche. It was a little early for Nietzsche, actually. So it's hard to do that. That's why I like the idea of a CA. In a free parliamentary vote.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's turn now a bit to what people can do, because there's always a lot of chatter on like, what can I do? So we know electoral reform, it's a really difficult problem because once, the distortions of first past the post benefit a party such that they gain power, they tend to abandon their electoral reform promise. So in your view, what strategies can the public use to break this cycle of broken promises on electoral reform, especially when the traditional political accountability mechanisms feel powerless to us because we don't feel like politicians listen?
I always want to let Laura go first, but I also feel like that's not fair. I'll take the lead. I can't even get my chair to work though, so I don't know how good. I'm in this. When you buy everything new at once, which is something I've done. I did a couple of years ago. I bought a desk, bought a chair, bought a computer, bought a coffee maker, and then everything breaks at once, and you just feel like, you can't figure anything out.
Yeah.
That's where I am right now. So take all of this with a grain of salt because I can't get my chair, my coffee maker, or my heater to work. I think it's going to be really hard to have a groundswell grassroots national movement for electoral reform because I just don't think it's ever going to be an issue that's salient to a critical mass of people, absent something that primes them to think that it's relevant to them, which is to say a really wonky electoral outcome that really upsets people. And if we sit around waiting for that, we're going to be sitting around probably for a long time. If we just sit around waiting for the right confluence of things. Part of it, I think, is finding champions, elite champions. And I say elite, which is to say political elite, people who are in parliament, people who lead parties, people whatever, and working those folks. Working the people who, if they win, they're going to be a force multiplier because they're going to account for what would be, hundreds of thousands of grassroots supporters because they'll bring those folks along. Like they'll be the leaders for the issue, and they will be heuristics for other people to look to. They'll be guides. They'll bring folks along, and getting the parties to commit. So imagine getting the NDP and the Greens and maybe the Bloc to commit to a process like this, because I can imagine a world in which those three parties could. And I can also imagine a situation in which they might end up in a position where they could push this sort of thing ahead, like a minority. Say we end up in a minority parliament in 2020, late 2021, fall 2021, or something like that, back where we are. But with the opposition parties in a position to get some real demands from the Liberals, or maybe another electoral cycle from now, or the Conservatives for that matter. Having those folks committed to something and then getting them to do it, I think is the best way, rather than, no one's taken to the streets en masse for this, as much as we might want them to or think they should. They won't. I think getting the elites and then waiting for the right moment is the way to do it. The work that Fair Vote's doing, coming up with a clear plan, coming up with a strategic vision, coming up with specific asks, and then pushing folks to adopt that.
Great. Laura?
Yeah, I think I would agree on that. I think that, you know, the easiest way to get politicians to do what you want is to punish them when you don't, right? But as David pointed out, 2019 didn't really punish Trudeau's government for what they had promised and then broke in 2015, right? And it's also not the biggest issue on the table, you know, and so if people were committed to getting rid of the Liberals, and you can have all sorts of reasons to doing that, but if it was just for electoral reform, you have to really think about your options. I mean, it's not an easy thing to figure out. So I do agree that getting people like who believe in this kind of system, maybe I can't see the Conservatives working with an NDP in a minority government, I have to be honest. But should we head into that territory again, Liberals and NDP potentially working together, maybe they can extract promises in order to provide cooperation, something like that. I mean, I can see that working, because I do agree that whatever process has to be something that the government just plain out commits to. And, as you were talking, David, I was remembering one of the things that came out soon after the abandonment of electoral reform was a bill that was put forward to have gender parity or fines, if there wasn't, for political candidates and parties. And this was a big reason that had been brought forward, right? One of the main reasons for electoral reform, to try and improve representation. And it died, right? The Liberals killed it. And if you're like, okay, wait a second here. If we think that this is a good thing, and aren't you it's 2015 party, then why didn't you support this? So, I mean, the problem is it's holding people to kind of our expectations of them, or holding politicians to our expectations of them is quite a challenge on an issue like this, where, I'll say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which I don't really mean, because I'm going to say that there would be lots of things that could be fixed appropriately, but it is functioning. And I say this in light of the recent debacle in the States. Okay. So, the fact that we do in fact have peaceful turnover of power is something that we can still be proud of. If our parliament could be better representative of the issues of the public, and that's a different thing altogether.
Fantastic. So there's one question I wanted to address that was in our Q&A, and it'll probably be the last question tonight. But, we were speaking earlier about some of the, the talking points that the Liberal Party was using as a means of justifying their, shutting down the electoral reform process. And one of those was it could give rise to extremist parties. So one of our Q&A questions was, what's the evidence here for PR empowering extremist views? And, is this something that's a real concern in proportion, I guess, to the benefits that proportional representation might bring us?
I'll say it is a real concern. I don't think it's a reason to kill the process. So I'm not going to agree with the justification so much as I will agree that it is something that you need to take seriously. And there are many ways to address it within a PR system. So the standard one would be thresholds for various parties to hold seats in Parliament. And this is what happens in Germany, for example, and various other places. So it's not that you can't figure out ways to address it. It is an issue, right? After New Zealand switched over to MMP, small parties holding that balance of power just enough to get them over the threshold to have a majority of support in Parliament I think that is something we do need to be worried about, especially because Canada is regionalized, especially because we do see groups rising up at various times, like Wexit, what would that mean? And I don't mean this in a facetious way. Like, I think you can manage this, but it is something we do need to be considering because I just taught Alan Cairns this week, and one of the things he talked about was how our electoral system really led to the way that parties do or do not have to kind of nationalize their support or look for support nationally, right? And if you can, get into office, well, we see this with the Bloc Québécois all the time, right? If you can get into the office with the concentrated support just from one area, then you're not necessarily going to be national in your views or in your approach or even what you're asking for. And imagine how difficult compromise could be. So while I don't mean we should, not think about this at all, I do think that we have to be cognizant of the specific challenges that may exist in the Canadian case and, design systems that are aware of kind of these tendencies.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I think, although at the same time, it's fascinating to see that the sort of, you do get governments that have sort of regional support blocks, like the Liberals, for instance. I mean, Ken Carty's got his book on the Liberal Party is quite good, where he says, the Liberal Party keeps remaking itself, and it still wins, but each time it wins with a little bit less support nationally than it had before. And so it's become, Ken argues, that's effectively become a regional party of sort of Ontario plus X, Y, or Z. And I think, party folks know that they don't need to win the entire country. They can win swaths of it, although they still have to be broadly appealing. So I think Laura's absolutely right. I do think at the same time, it's worth having a strategy for countering some of the more caricature attempts of PR. If Canada adopts PR, will be Austria. Everyone always talks about Italy and pizza parliaments, which I'm very keen to do away with that phrase. In Austria and extremism in Austria. I think we have to take that problem that seriously, but Austria is not a good analog for Canada for lots of reasons, including Austria has a far right problem, not a PR problem. And by the way, it's not the first time Austria's had a far right problem, right? So, there are political, but that's by way of saying there are political cultural elements too, that if you transplant these systems in different places, you're going to get different outcomes because there are different political cultures that emerge from all kinds of different things. But it is something we should very, very seriously take very, very seriously in Canada. And so I don't think, you can just ignore the point, as Laura says, but I also don't think it's fair to sort of take extreme examples and say, well, that's going to be Canada. It'll be Israel, it'll be Italy, it'll be Austria, because it probably wouldn't, right? And it's worth talking about that. But it's also worth thinking about how we might do complementary things at the same time that would empower folks. For instance, my most heretical position, and I say this as a market socialist who supports things like wealth caps and worker-owned enterprises and all kinds of stuff, is that I think we should have twice as many folks in the House of Commons, give or take. There are other things we can build in to make space for more representative institutions that would complement PR. And I think we should think about that alongside reforms.
Just really quickly here, what's a pizza party?
Oh, pizza parliament.
Oh, pizza parliament, sorry. What's a pizza parliament?
It's a parliament made up of all different kinds of bunch of small parties are all flying to. Italy again, but again, that speaks to the point, like, Italy goes through prime ministers really fast, and parties for governments really quickly for the most part. But that's not, it's like people have never heard of Garibaldi. It's like Italy's problems come from Italy's history and its institutions, its political culture, the same that Austria's does, and so on and so forth. I think we often forget that when we think that we'll become the same as X, Y, or Z.
So just because we're getting a couple questions in the chat about it, I know we're at 6 o'clock, but really interesting points, like what does make us different than Israel or Italy, for example, where there are dysfunctional parliaments, or, like if anyone's seen Borgen on Netflix, what is to say that the Canadian government system would not devolve into a dysfunctional system?
Well, there's nothing to say it wouldn't, but there's also nothing to say that we wouldn't really now. And I'll say that because, there's something in political science called Duverger's law, which Canada has regularly broken time and time again. And Duverger's law basically is the argument that if you have a single member plurality system like we do, you're really going to only have two parties, because why would anyone other bother? Either they're the runner-up or not, and why would anyone vote for a party that's not either the winner or the runner-up? Okay, that's the logic behind it. So it has to, anyway, it's a very rational argument that we have consistently failed. And it's one of the biggest things that got me interested in doing political science. And so there's no guarantee ever, right, that we wouldn't devolve into something crazy today versus tomorrow. No one could have predicted 1993, right? That was crazy. really, if you in the scheme of things, it was dramatic. And so we can't predict, maybe we'd have full on open PR, no thresholds, nothing, and we'd still maintain the party system we have. We really can't know. There's always, what we do know is that the incentives that could be in place. But David made a good point about political culture. I mean, it also comes to ethno-linguistic heterogeneity. That's what typically would be studied, right? So what are the cleavages in society that exist that could turn into parties? We're probably not going to see a class-based party to that extent here in Canada for that reason. So there's no guarantee in any of these systems, I think.
I will just add to that really quickly. I'm trying to, somebody made this point years ago. I can't remember who, probably lots of people have. Also, I'll just cite it generally. I think maybe Peter Lowen was the last person I heard making it. But, either you do the negotiation ahead of time before elections and you have these parties, brokerage parties or a couple of regional parties, whatever, but you coalesce before the election, or you coalesce after the election in Parliament where you find a workable coalition to govern, right? Like there's going to be coalition building either way. These groups are going to come together either before the election or after the election. It's going to happen either way. The question is, do we want it to happen through these big brokerage parties or through this other process after the fact? The one thing I would add about the sort of big party brokerage thing is, if those parties do get captured by an unsavory lot, this is one of the things I often say to the extremist point, then they end up with the whole shebang, right? Like, well, it couldn't possibly happen, right? There's no way a populist authoritarian in a consolidated democracy could ever come along and seize a party, right? There's no evidence of that in the last 4 years. It's like, what happened if, someone had seized the Conservative Party, for instance, and taken that direction? It could have happened, because all they have to do is win their leadership, and then who knows? And so that's one of the pushbacks, is that that exists now, and in some ways it's even more sinister in some ways now. So I mean, it's worth thinking about that bit too.
Fantastic.
It was Trump, by the way, I was thinking of.
Sorry?
It was Trump I was thinking of.
Oh, really?
Now I know.
Didn't catch that. Yeah.
No, I know. Sometimes
Thanks.
I'm enigmatic like that.
Okay, so we are a few minutes past time, so I'm going to wrap up here and just say thanks to everybody for setting aside the time to join tonight. Thanks so much to David and to Laura for all the great info and the perspectives that you've shared. So as Michelle's been sharing in the chat, a recording of tonight's webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or send it to a friend. And if you'd like to receive an invitation to our next webinar, you can sign up for our mailing list. And lastly, if you want to learn more about supporting the movement for PR, your browser will automatically take you to a page on our website showing the top 10 actions that you can take to advocate for PR. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, David, and to Laura, and good night.